I'm here today with Dr. Larry Perkins of Acts Seminaries to discuss the relationship between the Septuagint and the New Testament. So Larry will be teaching a course on this topic this fall, and he's agreed to share some thoughts to help us think through these issues. Thank you, Larry, and welcome.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here with you.
Yes. So we thought we'd divide this conversation in various sections or topics. And for the first one, we wanted to talk about broader methodological concerns. And so I have a couple questions for you along those lines. And the first one would be, what is or what would be a proper starting point for this type of investigation? So would it be too strong a statement to say that we know nothing about the use of Jewish scriptures by the first generation of Jesus followers outside of the documents of the New Testament?
Yeah, a great question, Jean. Discerning the appropriate sort of starting point of any research is critical to achieving, a good outcome. And in my opinion, the understanding of the relationship between Septuagint and sort of the Greek translation of the Jewish sacred scriptures and New Testament has to start with the New Testament documents. These documents provide us with our only point of access to what the first generation of Christians were thinking about the Jewish sacred texts and so forth. And so this, first of all, requires us, I think, to describe the many different ways in which these early Christian leaders were accessing and engaging these Jewish texts and their purposes, and to some extent their motivations for doing this, to the extent that we can. Because this Christian sect emerges from within Judaism, we also then have to compare how these leaders and writers employ these Jewish traditions within the general context of Second Temple Judaism and other Jewish groups that we know were active in engaging these texts. And we can think about the Essenes or the Bar Kokhba movement a little later in the first century, and the documents that have survived in the Dead Sea Scrolls from these groups. We can think about Philo and his interaction with this material, being sort of contemporary with some of the early Christian leaders. And then again, a little later in the first century, we have Josephus, of course, and his interaction with these materials, and then other elements in Second Temple Jewish literature. So we have kind of an array of approaches to this set of documents within the Jewish tradition. And the New Testament documents are one part of this sort of understanding of how these texts were being appropriated within Second Temple Judaism. And then when we come to the first generation of Christianity, I think we also have to reflect how the influence of Jesus on this new movement's use of the Jewish texts has been operative. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, the influence of the teacher of righteousness seems to be quite significant in their hermeneutic. So presumably the way that Jesus interacted with these materials was also in a similar fashion significant for these early Christian writers and leaders. So as we engage each New Testament document, then in regards to this question, we begin to discern sort of how and to what extent then they were perhaps engaging specifically the Old Greek or Septuagint texts, and perhaps its later revisions and so forth, or perhaps in some cases even Hebrew textual traditions that they might have been able to access and so forth. And so we have to do all of this then with a clear sense, in my opinion, of how Jewish people in the first century viewed the Old Greek translation and used it in their terms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Larry. So you mentioned texts, and perhaps one of the most common questions that comes up when discussing the relationship between the Septuagint and the New Testament has to do with Old Testament passages that are cited by the New Testament authors. Sometimes it matches what's found in the Septuagint, sometimes it doesn't. I remember one of the first assignments that I took on when studying the New Testament was to compare these quotations of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible in the epistles, and to try to determine the source of the quotation, whether it was a Hebrew text, such as the Masoretic text, or the Septuagint, whatever that means,
Mhm.
or something else. And it was a lot more complicated than I initially imagined. So why is this?
Yes, again, this is one of the, I think, intriguing elements of trying to understand the relationship between Septuagint and New Testament. I think one issue that, excuse me, one issue that does need to be sort of explored is whether or not Jews and Jewish Christians in the early first century would have regarded the Septuagint as merely a translation, or whether or not they would see it as having equivalent status with what we might call the Hebraica Veritas. Um, did they understand the Greek and Hebrew traditions as equally inspired and authoritative as Philo, for example, apparently did, a contemporary of some of those that were engaged in New Testament document writing? And if so, how do we understand the implications of our answer when we think about divergencies that we might observe between Old Testament texts that are in Greek and perhaps related to Septuagint, and those that perhaps might be found in the Hebrew tradition and so forth, and the implications of those things. We do know, of course, that various Hebrew and Greek texts were in use and circulating within Second Temple Judaism in the first century CE. And in the case of the Hebrew textual tradition, of course, we have things like the Samaritan Pentateuch. We have the Hebrew text that underlies the Septuagint translation. We have what some are now calling a Proto-Masoretic type of tradition. And so we have to ask, well, which of these might the New Testament writers have had access to? And similarly, in the case of the Old Greek translations and that kind of thing of the various documents, we know that they were being revised in some way in the centuries immediately preceding the emergence of the early church because of the data we find in early Jewish papyri of the Septuagint, as well as, of course, the Minor Prophets scroll that was found at Nahal Hever. And even though the dating of that perhaps places it contemporary with the New Testament, it does show that there was serious work being done to sort of bring the text of the Old Greek translation more into alignment with perhaps an emerging, what might we call settled or authoritative Hebrew text within Second Temple Judaism. And then also in terms of the Septuagint, we have some documents that are in multiple editions, like Judges or Daniel. And again, which of these documents did a New Testament writer access and for what reasons and this kind of thing. So we don't know to some degree what text the New Testament writers might have accessed. We don't know whether they had direct access to these documents, or maybe they were just having to cite material from memory, having just heard it orally in various places and situations. So lots of questions and lots of variety within both the Old Greek textual tradition as well as the Hebrew textual tradition in those cases. And that's not to mention then the variations that we find in the New Testament texts themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we'll get into some of these issues in more detail later. In the meantime, I was wondering if you could recommend some resources to people who may want to familiarize themselves with this topic and the broader issues that we've just mentioned.
Yes, probably the basic resource that most people will find accessible is the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, edited by Gregory Beale and Don Carson, as well as the second edition of the Invitation to the Septuagint, authored by Karen Jobes and Moises Silva. And then if one has developed a kind of general sense of how things work, you might then go on to read Tim McClay's The Use of the Septuagint in New Testament Research, or Martin Hengel's The Septuagint as Christian Scripture, or perhaps Mogens Mueller, The First Bible of the Church, A Plea for the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.